All right, get ready because we're taking a deep dive today into a chapter that kind of throws a wrench into the whole plan your financial life thing.
Oh, is this a wrench we should be worried about?
Maybe, maybe not. It's chapter 14 from Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money called You'll Change.
Okay, I know that one.
And he makes a pretty good argument that long-term financial planning, it's a lot tougher than we might think.
Yeah, than we think.
Mostly because people change.
Well, yeah. I mean, isn't that kind of obvious?
You'd think so, right? But how many of us really bake that into our plans? Like really, really consider it?
Good point. We probably underestimate that.
That's what Housel's getting at.
Yeah.
Like how many of us are actually living out the career we dreamed of as kids?
Not many, I'd bet.
Housel actually uses this funny analogy of a kid obsessed with tractors.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
When you're 5 years old, driving a tractor, that's the ultimate dream job, right?
Of course, of course.
But then as that kid grows up, the world opens up, they find other interests.
Exactly. Driving a tractor suddenly doesn't seem so glamorous.
And it's not just about tractors, it's a bigger point about how our desires and priorities, they just naturally shift over time.
Right.
So what we're super into today, it might be completely different from what we want 10, 20 years down the road.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the whole end of history illusion comes in, which Housel talks about in this chapter.
Like the end of history illusion. That sounds kind of ominous. What is that?
It's a psychological thing, a bias where we underestimate just how much will change in the future.
So we think we've got it all figured out now.
Yeah, kind of. We look at ourselves today and think, this is it, this is who I am, this is what I'll want forever.
Oh, wow. We think we've reached our final form.
Yeah, and that illusion of stability, it leads us to make these really rigid, long-term plans that we might end up regretting.
Because we're not actually done evolving.
Nope. Not even close. We're always changing, shaped by our experiences, relationships, just by aging.
That reminds me of that crazy statistic Housel brings up. Only 27% of college grads actually end up in jobs relating to their majors.
Yeah, that's a wild one. And 27% of stay-at-home parents have a college degree as well.
So we change our minds about big life choices, too, not just careers.
Totally. Like whether to prioritize family over a career, that can change too.
It really drives home the point that our future selves, they might have totally different values and goals.
And who we are today.
Yeah.
Now, earlier in the book, Housel talked about Ronald Reed, the janitor who secretly built a fortune.
Oh, yeah, that guy.
And then there's Warren Buffett, the king of investing.
Two very different guys.
Both super successful. How did their stories fit into this whole will change idea?
It's interesting, actually. Most people change their minds, their careers, multiple times.
But not these guys.
Nope. Both Reed and Buffett, they had this crazy long-term commitment. Reed just kept investing in the stock market for decades, while Buffett stuck with his value investing strategy.
So no sudden shifts, no chasing the latest trend. Nope. It was all about endurance, consistency.
So maybe the lesson here, even though we're talking about how much we change, is that we need to find the right things to be consistent about.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of compounding.
Oh, right, that snowball effect.
Exactly. Needs time and consistency to really gain momentum, switching things up all the time, chasing the new shiny thing. It can really work against that.
Okay, consistency is key, but we're wired to change, right? How do we reconcile those two things?
That is the million-dollar question.
How do we find something we can stick with, even as our wants and needs shift over time?
Housel actually suggests a really helpful way to think about it. Break an 80-year lifespan into 4 20-year blocks.
4 20-year blocks, huh? Interesting. So tell me more about these phases. How do they relate to financial planning?
Well, each phase is a different life stage, and they all come with different financial needs and priorities.
Okay, yeah.
So your 20s, that's all about exploration, building a foundation.
You're just starting out.
Then your 30s and 40s, those are usually focused on family, career growth.
You're building your life.
And then you hit your 50s and 60s, things shift again, more toward financial security, retirement planning.
Okay, so we're acknowledging that different stages have different needs.
Exactly. And it's not just about acknowledging them, it's about understanding that there are extremes to avoid when it comes to planning.
Extremes, okay. What kind of extremes are we talking about here?
Well, one trap is assuming you need to have it all figured out.
Like planning out every financial scenario for the next 50 years.
Yeah, that's a recipe for paralysis.
I could see how that would be a problem.
You're stuck in spreadsheets, missing out on the present moment, and the flexibility to jump on new opportunities.
So we need to avoid trying to plan for everything.
Definitely. Now, the opposite danger is getting so fixated on endless returns.
Okay, so endless returns, what's wrong with that?
Well, some people get so caught up in maximizing their wealth that they end up miserable, even if their portfolio is doing great.
So it's like working yourself to the bone to buy a fancy car, but then being too tired to enjoy driving it.
Exactly. It defeats the whole purpose, right?
So how do we find that balance? Planning for the future without becoming a slave to spreadsheets or missing out on actually living a good life?
That's the key question. I think Housel really hits the nail on the head by emphasizing that some of the most rewarding things in life just happen outside of our plans.
It just happened.
Like falling in love, starting a family, discovering a passion you never knew you had. Those things rarely follow a schedule.
It's true. It's all about leaving room for serendipity.
Right. If we overschedule our lives and our finances, we could miss out on those unexpected opportunities.
Opportunities for growth and joy.
Yeah. It's all about building that flexibility into our financial plans.
Okay, I like that. So having a solid foundation, saving, investing wisely, managing debt, all that good stuff, but also leaving some wiggle room.
That's the idea. Life unfolds in unexpected ways.
I like to think of it like having a well-stocked pantry. You have your go-to ingredients, your staples.
Okay, I like that analogy.
But you're also open to trying new recipes, new flavors, adapting to what's in season.
I see what you're saying.
So just like a well-stocked pantry lets you whip up a meal when unexpected guests arrive, a flexible financial plan lets you navigate those unexpected life events.
Without derailing your long-term goals.
Exactly. So we're not ditching financial planning.
No, not at all.
We're just acknowledging that it needs to be more dynamic, more adaptable.
Embrace the change.
Right.
Right.
And speaking of change, how does the power of compounding fit into all of this? I thought we were moving away from rigid long-term plans.
We are, but we're not throwing long-term thinking out the window completely. Compounding is still super important, but it's about finding that sweet spot.
The sweet spot between consistency and adaptability.
That's it. It's not about sticking to the exact same investment or career path for 50 years.
More like finding something you can commit to for a decent chunk of time to let the magic happen.
And then being willing to adjust course as your life changes. Remember Ronald Reed?
The janitor.
He consistently invested for decades, but his career path was actually pretty flexible. Janitor, gas station attendant, even a mechanic at one point.
So consistent investing, adaptable career. I like it.
It highlights another important point. Compounding isn't just about money. It applies to everything. Relationships, health, skills, knowledge.
It's the small, consistent actions over time.
That's the key.
So when it comes to finances, it's about making consistent progress towards our goals, even if those goals change over time.
That's the compounding mindset.
This is making a lot of sense now. It's not about predicting the future with perfect certainty.
It's more about cultivating a mindset.
A mindset of adaptability, resilience, consistent progress.
You got it.
But with all this talk about flexibility and change, what are some practical steps we can take to build that adaptable foundation?
That's where things get interesting. It all starts with really understanding where you are financially right now.
Like taking inventory, right?
Exactly. Like before a road trip, you need to know you've got enough gas, all the essentials packed.
Before you hit the road.
You need a clear picture. Your income, expenses, assets, debts.
The whole picture.
Once you have that, you can set realistic goals, a plan that aligns with your values and aspirations.
But how do we make sure those goals are flexible enough to account for all those changes life is going to throw our way?
That's the challenge. One strategy is to create what I call a core plan.
A core plan.
Yeah. This focuses on the absolute essentials: saving, investing, managing debt, and insurance.
Those are the non-negotiables, right?
Exactly. Your financial bedrock. Think of it like the foundation of a house.
Okay, so the core plan is the foundation.
It needs to be strong and stable.
To support everything else.
Now, around that core, you can build in those layers of flexibility.
The layers of flexibility. Yeah.
This might be a robust emergency fund, different investment options, maybe even considering multiple career paths.
So we're not trying to lock ourselves into one rigid plan.
Nope.
We're creating a framework that can adapt.
Adapt and evolve.
Okay, so we're prepared for the unexpected, but still keeping our eyes on the prize.
And just as important as building that framework is regularly reviewing and adjusting it.
Because life happens.
Priorities change.
Right. It's not set it and forget it.
It's ongoing assessment, adjustment, fine-tuning.
But that's where things can get tricky. How do we make sure we're making sound financial decisions when, let's face it, our emotions are running high or we're feeling the pressure of those big life changes.
You've hit on a critical point. Understanding our own psychology is crucial here.
Okay, let's talk about that. What are some of those psychological traps when it comes to money?
Oh, we've all fallen for them at some point.
I know I have.
One of the big ones is loss aversion.
Loss aversion.
Basically, we feel the pain of a loss way more strongly than the pleasure of an equal gain.
That makes sense.
It's why people hold on to those losing investments, hoping they'll bounce back.
Oh, yeah, been there.
We hate admitting defeat, even if it makes financial sense to move on.
I've definitely held on to some losers for too long.
It happens to the best of us. Another one is anchoring.
Anchoring.
We get fixated on the first piece of information we see, even if it's not relevant anymore.
Oh, so if I buy a stock at $50 and drops to $25, I might be hesitant to sell because I'm stuck on that $50.
Exactly. Anchored to that first number.
And then there's confirmation bias.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
We look for information that supports what we already believe.
Even if our beliefs are wrong.
Like if I'm convinced real estate is always a good investment, I might ignore all the signs of a housing bubble.
We all do it to some extent. Our brains can really sabotage us if we're not careful.
So knowing this, how do we make more rational decisions?
First step is to slow down. No impulsive moves based on fear, greed, or whatever the financial news is screaming about.
Take a breath.
Do your research, look at different perspectives, really think through the long-term implications.
Pause before we leap.
Exactly. And another helpful thing is to get objective advice from someone you trust.
A financial advisor, a mentor, a friend who knows their stuff.
Having that outside perspective can be super valuable.
Someone to challenge our assumptions, offer a fresh view.
And remember, personal finance is personal.
There's no one-size-fits-all.
What works for one person might not work for another.
It's about finding what aligns with your own values, goals, risk tolerance.
Exactly.
This has been so eye-opening.
I'm glad to hear it.
I'm seeing financial planning in a whole new light now.
Less about rigid rules.
Yeah, and more about adaptability, self-awareness, embracing the unknown.
And that's what makes this chapter so powerful. It's a reminder that our lives and our financial needs, they're constantly evolving.
There's no finish line.
When it comes to personal growth, including our finances.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Don't just acknowledge that you'll change, embrace it.
Embrace the change.
Don't be afraid of it. See it as an opportunity for growth, learning, adaptation.
And build that understanding into our financial planning.
Yes. Create a framework that can evolve with you, seek knowledge and advice, and don't be afraid to adjust course as you go.
Easier said than done sometimes.
True, but it's a mantra worth repeating.
Absolutely. Now, how about we move on to the final part of our deep dive? I think our listeners are ready for some concrete action steps.
Let's do it. We've laid the groundwork, explored the mindset shifts. Now it's time to get tactical.
We've talked a lot about flexibility, embracing change, and really understanding ourselves when it comes to money.
The psychology of it all.
Now, let's talk about what we can actually do. How do we build a financial plan that can adapt as our lives change?
Well, the first step is pretty simple, but a lot of people skip it.
Oh, what is it?
You absolutely have to know where you stand financially right now.
Makes sense. Before we even think about goals or plans.
Gotta take a good hard look at the present.
So it's like taking a financial inventory.
Exactly. What's your income? Your expenses? What assets do you have? How much debt are you carrying?
So it's like checking the map before you start a road trip.
Yeah, you need to know your starting point before you can figure out how to get to your destination.
Makes sense. So once we've got that snapshot of our finances,
then we can start thinking about goals.
And a plan that actually aligns with our values and what we want to achieve.
Exactly. But remember, those aspirations might change.
Right. That's what this whole chapter is about. How do we bake in that flexibility?
That's where the idea of a core plan comes in.
A core plan. Okay.
This is your foundation, the non-negotiables.
The bedrock.
It focuses on the fundamentals. Saving, investing, managing debt responsibly, and having insurance.
Those are the must-haves.
Exactly. Think of it like the foundation of a house.
It has to be solid to support everything else.
Right. And here's the key. Around that core plan, you build in layers of flexibility.
Okay, so the core is solid, but then we add some wiggle room.
Exactly. This might mean having a good emergency fund so you're covered if something unexpected happens.
Like losing your job or a medical emergency.
It could also mean exploring different investment options.
So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket.
And you can adjust your strategy as your goals change.
So instead of trying to fit into one rigid plan,
We create a framework that can change with us.
it can bend and flex.
Embrace the uncertainty.
Exactly. But with all this adapting and adjusting, where do we even begin?
Well, first and foremost, make saving a habit no matter how small the amount is.
Even if it's just a few dollars a week.
Even if it's just a few dollars, that consistency really adds up.
Small steps, big results.
Right. And as you build those savings, think about investing.
To help our money grow.
Exactly. Figure out what aligns with your goals and your risk tolerance. Do your research, talk to a financial advisor if you need to, but don't be afraid to get started.
You mentioned financial advisors, and I think that's a good point. Sometimes having that outside perspective can be really helpful.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you're feeling lost or overwhelmed.
They can help us make sense of it all.
A good advisor can create a personalized plan, answer your questions, and guide you through those tough spots.
And to keep us accountable.
And help us stay on track when those pesky psychological biases start creeping in.
Speaking of those biases, how do we avoid making those impulsive financial decisions when we're, let's say, not thinking clearly?
You're talking about when our emotions are running high.
Exactly.
Well, one thing you can do is create a cooling off period before you make any big decisions.
So if I'm about to buy that expensive thing I don't really need,
Or make a major investment.
I should take a step back.
Give yourself a few days, maybe even a week to think it over.
Sleep on it. Talk to someone.
See if you still feel the same way after the dust settles.
And if it doesn't feel right.
Walk away. There's no shame in changing your mind.
This is all such a good reminder that personal finance isn't just about numbers.
It's about understanding ourselves.
Our psychology, embracing change, making choices that align with what we truly value.
And that those values might change too.
Exactly. It's a journey, not a destination.
And the most important investment you can make is in your own self-awareness.
Your ability to adapt and roll with the punches.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been great. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. But where do we go from here? What are some concrete steps our listeners can take today to start building that adaptable financial plan we've been talking about?
I'm glad you asked. Let's get into some specifics.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks here.
Brass tacks, I like it.
We've laid the groundwork, explored the whole mindset thing, but what can our listeners actually do? What are the concrete steps to build a financial plan that can really roll with those punches?
Well, I'm glad you asked. You know, it all starts with that first step we talked about, really understanding where you are financially right now.
Right, that financial inventory.
And I know it sounds simple, but it's amazing how many people kind of gloss over this part.
You just want to jump into the fun stuff.
Exactly. But you got to know where you're starting from before you can map out the journey, right?
Okay, so income, expenses, assets, debts, the whole 9 yards.
The whole 9 yards. Once you got a handle on that, you can start thinking about setting realistic goals.
Goals that make sense for your situation.
And then craft a plan that really aligns with what you want to achieve in life.
But those aspirations, they can change, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's the whole point we've been talking about.
So how do we build a plan that can handle that? Knowing that what we want today might not be what we want 5, 10, 20 years down the line.
Right. Well, that's where this concept of a core plan comes in.
This is that foundation we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. It's your financial bedrock. Focuses on those essential pillars: saving consistently, investing wisely, managing debt responsibly, and having enough insurance.
Those are the must-haves no matter what.
Exactly, the non-negotiables. It's like building a house. You need a strong foundation to support everything else.
So the core plan is our foundation. Got it.
Yeah.
But we need some flexibility, right?
You got it. Around that solid core, you start building in layers of flexibility. For example, you got to have a good emergency fund. Something to cushion the blow if something unexpected happens.
Life throws those curveballs, right?
All the time. Job loss, medical emergency, you name it.
So an emergency fund helps us absorb those shocks.
Exactly. Then you can think about exploring different investment options, too.
Diversifying our portfolio.
So we're not putting all our eggs in one basket.
And we can adjust our strategy as our goals and risk tolerance evolve.
Right. It's all about having a framework that can change with us instead of trying to cram ourselves into one rigid plan.
So we bend and flex as life throws those curveballs our way.
You got it. And don't forget about those regular checkups.
Oh, right. Like with our health.
You wouldn't go years without seeing a doctor.
Boy.
Same thing with your financial plan. Things change, life throws curveballs, the economy goes up and down.
And our priorities change too.
It's important to review and adjust your plan as needed to make sure it's still working for you.
Makes sense. But all this adapting and adjusting, it can feel kind of overwhelming. Where do we even start?
It might sound too simple, but honestly, one of the best things you can do is just start saving.
Just start, even if it's a small amount.
Exactly. Even if it's just a few dollars a week, it's amazing how much it can add up over time.
Like they say, little by little, a little becomes a lot.
Right. You don't have to make drastic changes overnight. Just take those small, consistent steps.
And as those savings grow, then we can think about investing it.
Right. Putting that money to work.
So it can grow even more.
Exactly. Figure out what kind of investments align with your goals and how much risk you're comfortable with. There's tons of resources out there. You can talk to a financial advisor if you need some guidance, but the key is just to get started.
You mentioned financial advisors before, and I think that's a great resource for people who are feeling a little lost or intimidated by all of this.
Absolutely. Sometimes having that objective expert advice can be invaluable.
They can help us create a plan.
And answer all those questions we have.
And they can provide support and guidance, especially when things get a little rough.
Keep us accountable, too.
Yeah, that's important.
And help us navigate those tricky psychological biases we talked about earlier. Those can really trip us up.
Speaking of those biases, any other tips for avoiding those impulsive money decisions? You mentioned slowing down before, but what else can we do?
One thing that can be really helpful is to create a cooling off period before you make any big financial moves.
A cooling off period.
Okay, so let's say you're about to make a big purchase.
That new car, that fancy gadget.
Or a major investment, something significant.
You should pump the brakes.
Yeah, give yourself some time to think it through. A few days, a week even.
Step back from the situation.
Sleep on it. Talk to someone you trust. See if you still feel the same way after the dust settles.
And if it doesn't feel right?
Then walk away. There's no shame in changing your mind.
This whole conversation has been fantastic. It really is about more than just numbers and spreadsheets.
It's about understanding ourselves.
And embracing change.
And making choices that align with what we truly value, knowing those values might change too.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And remember, the most important investment you can make is in your own self-awareness.
Your ability to adapt and roll with whatever life throws your way.
You got it.
It's been a pleasure diving into this chapter with you today.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, personal finance is a journey, and the key is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep embracing those changes. See you next time.